So with that, I think we can go ahead and jump into things. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our webinar, Sky to Soil, Growing with Rainwater. A big shout out to the city of Petaluma for making this program and many others like it possible. Deep gratitude to them. My name is Connor Devane. I'm a climate resilience programs coordinator with Daily Acts. I'm just going to be leading us through some intro slides here before turning it over to Chris Clarke from Permaculture Artisans, our esteemed guest presenter, whom I'll introduce in just a few moments. So I recognize some familiar names on the attendee list and in the chat window, but I'm guessing that there are at least a handful of us here tonight who are new to Daily Acts. So I'd love to just take a minute or two here to introduce us and say a little bit about who we are and what we do. So Daily Acts is a holistic education nonprofit whose mission is to inspire transformative actions that create connected, equitable, and climate resilient communities. We believe in the power of small actions to reconnect people to self, to place, and to one another, which in turn helps heal our society and our planet. We have sort of a three-pronged approach for doing that that starts in the soil and swells into culture and policy change. So the first part is our climate resilience programs like this one that we're here for tonight that give people skills and resources to live richer, fuller lives while having a positive impact on the planet. Because we recognize that change happens through mindful collaboration, we invest in strengthening community leadership. One avenue for which is through our Leadership Institute for Just and Resilient Communities, which is accepting applications right now. It's a 10-month program that equips people to deal with the many problems that our communities are facing these days and the intersecting systems that affect those problems. We also are home to the Environmental Health Network and the youth program Eco to School. Last, we mobilize our community's power by building public and political will, by collaborating through networks and alliances, as well as with our municipalities and agencies to change the policy context around the climate crisis. So our impacts have been reaching far and wide over the past 20 years, but everything we do starts just like this, by getting community members in a room together, connecting and talking about the future we could build with one another. So at this point in May 2022, I am guessing that most of us are pretty familiar with Zoom, so I'll make this brief, but we're in webinar format. So we've got the chat box where you can talk with us and talk with one another. Just make sure you have your settings on all panelists and attendees. For some folks, it might be the everyone setting, but either way, just so that your messages are getting out to the group. If you have questions that arise during the webinar, please use the Q&A box. And Chris and I were talking before. I'll be moderating that throughout the presentation. So if questions come up that are relevant to what Chris is talking about in the moment, I'll probably bring those up then. And we will have a little bit of time at the end for questions as well. Last is just a note that any resources and links that are mentioned during the presentation, we'll be sending those to you in a follow-up email along with a recording of this presentation later this week. So keep an eye out for that. Hopefully you can stick with us throughout the whole event, but if you have to leave early, rest assured it is being recorded and you'll be able to catch up on anything you miss. So with that, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Chris Clarke. Chris was introduced to permaculture in 2009 while reading Gaia's Garden by the late and great Toby Hemingway. Inspired by the possibility of restoring habitats for otters, eagles, and everything in between while building abundance for all life, Chris moved to Northern California and finished 2 years of the Regenerative Design and Nature Awareness Program at the Regenerative Design Institute in Bolinas, California, and a 3rd year of Weaving Earth. He took two PDCs during that time, and ever hungry for more learning, he completed the ecological landscape immersion at the Permaculture Skills Center in 2016. Prior to his move west, Chris spent 3 years in Costa Rica as a Peace Corps volunteer and microfinance consultant, which allowed him to use his degrees in economics and Spanish while on a wild adventure. Chris is an associate designer at Permaculture Artisans, where he's mostly working on technical water designs. And I have to add, he's also a former Daily Acts staff member. So he is particularly well suited to lead us program tonight. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Connor, and thank you everyone for being here. I actually can't see any of you, so I won't be able to read the room, but Connor will let me know if there are questions, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just jump in. Does that look good, Connor?
Looks great.
Great. Okay, so simple title for this presentation tonight, rainwater harvesting. Connor had another one. I like this quote attributed to Benjamin Franklin: "When the well is dry, we'll know the worth of water." And I think there are wells that are starting to go dry. So that quote is powerful. It points to the reality that when something goes away, then we can really see how valuable it is. So I will keep moving along. Here we go. So I'm going to start off with context. Presumably, if you've been to a Daily X event before, this may be a review for you, but I think it's always useful to review things. So this is our planet Earth. This is a representation of all the water on the planet. If it was sucked up into a ball that represents it, this little second ball here would be all the liquid fresh water. And this tiny little one here is the fresh water in lakes and rivers. So very small. This is another chart that points in that direction. So oceans make up the vast majority of the water. Rivers are tiny, tiny percentage. And groundwater is 0.62%. I think what this points to is that water, fresh water, drinking water is a special thing. I added this little quote here from the Bureau of Reclamation website, which was very interesting. In actuality, that amount of water, these tiny percentages of water compared to ocean salt water and things like that, that amounts to an average of 2.2 million gallons of usable fresh water for each person on Earth. And that kind of, that struck me as a pretty, that's an amazing amount of water. And it to me points to the abundance that's available to us on this Earth, and the abundance of what's provided to us, even if there are locations and times when water feels scarce. Okay. So a little more context about our local watershed. This to me is particularly interesting because of the complexity that's involved in it. So it's this whole water cycle that starts up in the mountains, Sierras, and snow and rain, and eventually makes its way down into these lakes, all the way down Lake Mendocino to the Russian River. And what I want you all to take away from this more than anything is that this is a complex system. There are dams, multiple dams along the way. There are collector wells. There's an inflatable dam here. There's pumping plants. There's booster pumps. There's storage tanks. There's all these things. Chlorination facility. And I think it's important to realize that when we turn on a tap, particularly if it's municipal water, that water has gone through a long cycle to get to us. And water in California and all over the world is tied to big energy use, to pump it, to heat it, to clean it, all that sort of stuff. So just interesting to keep that in mind, that it's a complicated system that we use these days.
Chris, we had one question from your last slide.
Okay.
Ellen said 2.2 million gallons per person over what period of time?
Interesting question. I do not know the answer to that. That website from the Bureau of Reclamation did not say over the time period, but what they did say on there, which is shown in part in this slide here, it's a cycle, a water cycle. So I'll have to look into that one, but I like that question. So continuing a little bit with the idea of the use of our water, I don't want to spend too much time here. This is that same website that I was referring to before had an interesting chart showing the number of gallons approximately in different activities. Some of these numbers might be lower if you're using like a high efficiency washer or things like that, but taking baths, watering your lawn, washing cars, showers, depending on how you're doing that, use a lot of water. This is an important graph over here. Basically half of the residential water use is outdoors, happening outside, and leaks can make up a pretty good portion. And this website here had some other interesting facts about how much a leak can produce over certain periods of time. So about half of our water is being used inside, about half of it's being used outside. This is not really as on topic, but it's important to, I think it's another piece of context that's just interesting. Food and water. It takes water to grow food, obviously, and certain foods like steak or hamburgers require way more water than other types. According to this, if we want to conserve the most water, we'd want to eat lettuce and ketchup and sugar and wheat bread, which would probably not be the most thrilling diet, but just interesting to note these things. Okay, so jumping into a little bit with Petaluma in particular, I'm not going to read all this. This is a lot of writing, but this is off of the website. Because of ongoing drought, there are water restrictions happening, not just in Petaluma, but in Petaluma in particular. These are the water use restrictions. One that jumped out to me: no installing new landscapes or replanting existing landscapes that require water. No filling new pools or spas. That's a different level of things. No use of potable water for washing down sidewalks. So some of this stuff is not a huge deal. Some of it is a bigger deal. And these things are evolving over time. A little more context: as of 2 or 3 weeks ago, I saw a report that Healdsburg is proposing to raise their water rates over the next 5 years. And over those 5 years, that's going to add up to just about 30% increase for water. And this is a picture of a a recycled water truck that is now driving around and filling tanks for people. And that's kind of another way that people are finding to deal with issues with water. But so water is tied to energy, water is tied to money, and water is honestly tied to carbon. So resilience is a big sort of framework that I think is valuable to consider throughout this talk. There are probably lots of different ways to think about it, but I like to think about it at least through 3 lenses: personal, community, and ecological. This is a sweet little picture of someone's rainwater catchment system. Those are probably, those are probably 200 gallons each. So a total of 800 gallons that they're catching. And that's just like a nice little backup on the personal side. If these folks have caught this water here and there are water restrictions on municipal water or something like that, they've got some water that they're able to play around with. On a community level, if everyone was doing this, and if you remember back to that, the second slide that showed the watershed and all that, the complexity that it takes to get water to your home through the county. If there's a big earthquake or something like that, but everyone has a tank or 2 on the side of their house, if the water is disrupted at some point, it will be available. And there's the possibility of people sharing. If no one has this and water's disrupted, that's harder. That's going to be a harder situation. And on an ecological level, looking at how do we support the ecosystem around us, the plants, the wildlife, and all of those things. So the choices we make in the landscape will affect the resilience of the ecology. And another good word to think of with resilience is redundancy. So if I know that water is essential for life and for my well-being and the well-being of those around me, I don't want a single supply of water. I don't want to be 100% dependent upon a complex system with dams and pumps and all that sort of stuff to be the only way that I'm able to get water. So I might think about something like catchment or a well or whatever. There are different possibilities, but redundancy for important things is part of resilience. Okay.
Hey,
So,
Chris, before
yes.
you jump into the next slide, are you going to be talking about what people might expect for costs of various kinds of rainwater harvesting systems? We had a question about the system in that slide.
I can talk about, I'll talk about that a little bit later on.
Perfect.
Yeah. So this is an aerial view of Petaluma. Some nice greenery. There's a river running through it. There's a lot of buildings. There's a lot of sidewalks, things like that. Just an interesting view to look at. And then compared to this image here that I found online years ago, where if we look back at this slide and think about hardscapes and where's water going and where's food coming from, where's the nearest farm around here? There are farms in Petaluma, which is wonderful. Um, but man, this thing is clicking along too fast. But then looking at this, all the water that falls onto this landscape is going back into the earth. There's food growing all over the place. I can guarantee you that these folks know their neighbors and regularly interact with them. So this is another sort of interesting look at the way that some folks live and different ways of this I think would be a fairly resilient location to be in. Of course, dependent upon weather, as all of us are, but just an interesting juxtaposition between city and more rural. So stormwater, this is from OAAC, can either be a problem or a solution. Typically, we're paving, piping, and polluting, slowing it, spreading it, sinking it, which is a phrase from Brock Dolman out of OAAC, is another option, another possibility. So here is that first idea. Brad Lancaster, if you haven't heard of him, is a really great resource, harvestingrainwater.com. He's got a couple different books out, and he's from a really dry location in Southern California. And basically in this image, water that's getting onto the landscape is by design getting off as quick as possible. So it's going onto the roof and running into the road, into the drainage. And that's pretty typical. And that was the way that many homes were built for a long time. It was like, get it away from the house, get it off of the site. And so when that happens, if there's any sort of backup or if things aren't working with the drains or sewers properly, or if there's just a lot of water, it ends up in a situation like this. And I'm sure we've all been driving by and been splashed in something like that, or splashed someone in something like that. But that's water that's been shunted off of properties that has not gone to its proper location. And so that rainwater can contribute to these different things. Cracks here, damage to the house, flooding can damage wildlife, fish. This is an image. So everything that's on the road then ends up in the river or in the ocean eventually, because it's basically stuck on there until it rains, and then it rains and it goes into sewers, and sewers go straight into the creeks and landslides and things like that. So there's an effect to that super quick drainage. This is another image from Brad Lancaster, retaining the rain. So different perspective on water and different way to engage with things. So in this instance, this household is attempting to keep as much water on site as possible. So the water on the roof is going into a little tank. There's an overflow here into a basin. Because Brad Lancaster's living in such a dry place, he wants basins all over the place. That may or may not work on certain sites depending on where you're living, but the water's staying on site and eventually overflowing if need be out into the road. But he's even got what's called a curb cut to bring water off of the road onto his site, which is pretty cool. One of the benefits of this scenario, as opposed to the other one, is that the life in the soil is excellent at cleaning water, breaking things down. So the more that we can get the water moving through the soil, the cleaner the water can get. And then if you add in mycelium and different organisms, more organisms, a rich soil life, then the water gets more and more clean. So some people actually do things like this to try and clean water that might be dirty. 8 principles of rainwater harvesting, also from Brad Lancaster. Just useful to review, to go over. Begin with long and thoughtful observation. Pato is another word for that, protracted and thoughtful observation. So really trying to get a sense of what's going on before you jump in and start changing things. Start at the top or high point of your watershed and work your way down. So in this image, the top of this watershed is this roof. In this image, there's a watershed that's not in this image that's connected to it, but what's in the influence of this person's sphere is this top of the watershed. Start small and simple. Just try things out. Spread and infiltrate the flow of water. So like we saw here, water is spreading out all over the site, and because of these basins, it's designed to infiltrate. Always plan for an overflow, manage that overflow as a resource. So here's an overflow from this tank. This stuff, if it overflows, could come back onto the road. Living organic ground cover should be maximized. That's part of that soil life that's so important. Stack functions by maximizing beneficial relationships, and then continually reassess. So if we build a system like this and completely forget about it, there may be issues with it, and if we're not assessing it, then we miss those issues and it can create problems. Okay. So this is just a sweet little real life image of some of that slowing, spreading, and sinking. Swale, little pond with an overflow, fruit trees planted along the berm, so they're absorbing this water in a different way. And you could have series of these things depending on what you're trying to do, and capture a whole lot of water that would otherwise maybe be running away. Okay, so some strategies to retain the rain, like Brad Lancaster mentioned. You want to assess your resource and retention opportunities. If we're talking about design, I think constraints can actually be a really useful, it might not be as fun, but it's useful. There's a saying, out of form bursts creativity. So if you can constrain yourself or get clear on what your constraints are, that can really give you a sense of forward motion, what's possible. So time might be a constraint for you, money, space, your catchment potential. If you're in the desert, that's going to be a major constraint for you. Your soil type could be a constraint. If we can increase the living sponge, so the soil itself can act like a sponge. Another water wizard named Art Ludwig, who's in Southern California as well, had a pipe break. And this is the type of place where if you've got water running off of your property, people are mad at you because it's a tight resource. And so this big pipe broke. It took him about, I think, 10 minutes to fix, and he was upset. He was saying, "Oh my goodness, what are the neighbors going to think?" And he went and looked out on the road, and no water had gotten off of his property because his soil was so absorbent. It just all went back into that sponge. Installing rain barrels or tanks, swales or rain gardens, and again, slow it. So slowing that water down instead of running it off, spread it out, give it an opportunity to sink, store it. And I think Brock did add share it as well, because water is something to be shared. Okay. It's a lot
we had one more question come up, I think was probably in response to your image of the swale and retention pond.
Yeah.
But it would apply to rainwater above ground harvesting as well, which is how are mosquitoes handled with the open water bodies?
Typically, if there's a little pond or something like that, you can add mosquito fish and things like that. Ideally, you don't have a ton of standing water for a super long period of time if mosquitoes are an issue where you live. And part of that is trying to size things properly so it's draining out in an amount of time that mosquitoes aren't going to grow in there. But for something like a pond, you definitely want to add little fish that like to eat those larvae. So here's a comparison of earthworks and tanks that is useful. Those are earthworks are considered like passive rainwater catchment. Tanks are considered active. So cost, earthworks can be way less expensive, and you can do it just with a shovel. Tanks are likely more expensive. Both of these have large capacity on a, I think there are tanks that are big enough to store hundreds of thousands of gallons, but obviously those would be hugely expensive. But if we're talking about a pond in earthworks, you can store huge amounts of water there too. Water availability is going to be more limited with earthworks than with a tank. Both of these you can use to irrigate the garden. If it's in a tank, it's going to be easier to use in other ways. Both will require some maintenance. And if you're going to irrigate with tanks, typically you're going to want a pump or you need to play around with gravity in a certain way. The idea with earthworks is that you're basically letting that water sink in and then the soil absorbs it, and there's potentially less need for irrigation because there's more water in the mix. So we were talking about the living sponge, and if I was going to say, what's the cheapest way that I can catch water on a site and build soil, it would be mulching. There are people who will drop off mulch for free, arborists who don't, this is just clicking along, who don't want to deal with it, and you can put it onto your landscape. This will eventually break down and become soil, so you can keep topping it off, but that provides a barrier from evaporation. It does a lot of things, and it's kind of the most simple way to start the process. So some of the benefits of mulching: helps to increase infiltration instead of running off. So it's got all these nooks and crannies, unlike hardscape or something like that. Like I was saying, it reduces loss of soil moisture, can loosen soil over time, in part because water can find its way in and open things up. If it's an organic mulch, it can help build soil and it can suppress weeds. So there are a number of different materials, and fire's an interesting consideration to bring into all of this, an important consideration. I wish this was not happening. It's clicking along on its own for some reason. But bark or wood chips, that's what we were seeing in that other photo. It is long-lasting, organic. It could be expensive depending on what you get, certain types of bark or wood chips. Straw is inexpensive. Goodness, sorry about this. It does not last long. It will burn fast. Bark or wood chips will tend to smolder. Compost is a possibility. Again, that could be expensive. In the case of mulch, we'll often add, if we're sheet mulching, we'll do compost plus a couple of these other things, cardboard, and gravel is another consideration. So very long lasting. It's a mined product, so that's just something to be aware of. So here's just a picture of the wood chip mulch. There are different types. One thing to avoid is it's called like gorilla hair. It's basically shredded redwood, very fine fibers that is more flammable than other types. Bark is typically going to be less flammable if it's not shredded into tiny little pieces. Here's an image of that straw. So that's pretty typical on top of like a garden bed, and that's totally useful. It does blow away, but it's an effective mulch in certain instances. Compost, like I was saying, if you put it on and it's not aged enough, it could be too hot for the plant or too much nutrients, but that would over time age. But what I like to do and what Daily X likes to do is basically combine compost and then cardboard or newspaper, mostly cardboard though, and then a bark mulch on top of it, and that's a sheet mulch. And so that's a good combination of another thing, a number of benefits. Gravel mulch is another possibility. I don't typically like to put gravel into a landscape where I could use bark or something like that, or wood mulch. This, if it's not done well, is going to create a heat island that will absorb heat in a different way. It's coming from somewhere, oftentimes a quarry or a riverbed or something like that. So there's a bigger cost to that potentially. One other consideration with the with wood chips, if you are getting a free source of it, it can be useful to get a sense of where it's coming from, so that it's not like if someone's chipped up a bunch of sudden oak death wood, that could be problematic on your property if you've got oaks. So just being aware of that. So some tips for mulching: you can apply 2 to 4 inches. That'll typically be a nice level of ground cover. If we're talking about sheet mulching, compost on the bottom and then your carbon material on the top. And if you're working with an infiltration basin, you want to mulch those. I'll talk more about that. I typically would avoid something that's going to be able to lift up really easily if water fills in. A few things to be aware of. Cautions. You don't want to mulch right next to a plant. That can damage it. If it's on too steep a slope, it may run off. If it's too thick, it can actually block oxygen getting down there. And again, if it's too thick, if it rains just a little bit, all that water is potentially going to go just into the mulch. But over time, it will break down and become more like soil. So this is an issue that we can see from time to time, where people have mulched up too high onto a tree, and it can create rot. So something to be aware of, giving a little bit of space. Okay, so switching gears here to a little bit more about getting a sense of water falling from the sky. So a way that you can figure out how much water potential you've got on your property or wherever you're living is you can get square foot measurement of your roof. You can do that through Google Earth Pro, which is a free software. And there's a polygon tool and you can just grab a basic square footage. You could also just walk around your property and take that measurement. And then you want to get your rainfall in feet. So you could look that up online, get a general sense, average sense. And then you would multiply those two numbers by 7.48, which gives you gallons per cubic foot. So an example of that, the average roof size of an American home is 2,500 square feet. The average rainfall in Petaluma is 30 inches. So that's 2.5 feet times 7.48 to give us gallons. So that's a lot of water. Almost 48,000 gallons of water in a year in a typical average rainfall. So oftentimes, I talked about constraints. Oftentimes, if you're getting a decent amount of rain, your catchment potential is not your constraint. If we have this, if it's a rough drought year, we're still looking at 23,000 gallons coming off of this roof. So that's just interesting to note. So this is important if we're talking about earthworks on your property. So if we've got 47,000 gallons coming off of your roof and you send that into a rain garden or something, and you're not clear on what your soil looks like or what your percolation rates look like, that could be problematic for you. You could get totally overfilled. The water might not, if you're in a clay heavy location, it might take you 24 hours to have that water go down. And if it keeps pumping off, then where does the water go? So a percolation test is a really simple thing to do. You can basically dig a hole. You could dig a hole the size of a 5-gallon bucket or something like that, and then pour that 5-gallon bucket full of water, or you can take a hose, whatever it is, and fill that hole and time it to see how long it takes to drop. In this picture, they've got a ruler in there, so they're actually measuring inches, how many inches in how much time. And so you can look here, there's infiltration rates. If it took 0 to 30 inches, minutes per inch of dropping, then you'd need 0.4 square feet per gallon per day. If it takes longer, then the amount of area that you need increases. And this is different soil types are going to have different qualities, so they're going to play around with water in different ways. So if you pour a bunch of water into sand, it's just going to go straight through. If you pour a bunch of water into clay, different story. It's going to spread out. It may take a long time to absorb in. So with that perk test, ideally you would fill that once, do the test, and fill it again and do the test again. Because if we're talking about a rain garden in the middle of winter, it's going to behave very differently than what happens with that first rain. So that gives you an opportunity to see what happens when the soil is saturated. So that's a really simple at-home test to get a sense of what your soil is how it's gonna work. So we're gonna talk a little bit about infiltration basins. I'm gonna go through some different techniques and possibilities. So this is a similar image to what we saw earlier from Brad Lancaster. So another name for infiltration basin is rain garden. The idea is basically let's create a space where water can slow down and sink in. So some of the benefits, instead of running off like we saw in some of those other pictures, there's a basin to contain that water. If it's upslope, if you've got water upslope, it can come and can get in there. It can also act as a spot where silt or leaf litter or things like that run off and capture in there. You could put roof runoff or gray water into it. And it's also a way to define planting areas. So here are a couple examples of rain gardens installed by Permaculture Artisans. Like a dry creek bed is another way that we could describe this, but basically water that comes into this location is going to slow down and sink in. Same here, we've got some walls. Typically, we like to, we will use gravel in rain gardens, in swales sometimes, we'll talk about a little bit later. You can seed and straw those, but if we're filling water into this basin and we've got straw or we've got light mulch like what's out here, it will potentially lift up and float away. That won't happen with this gravel mulch. So it's part of the reality. Locating these, ideally it's on a more or less flat or gently sloped. We'd like it to be lower than the surrounding hardscapes and paths. So here's hardscape, here's a path, here's a path. They're sunken in a little bit. Located at least 10 feet away from building foundations. I think that's a good idea. That might not always be fully possible, but that's a good way to protect a building. And you don't want them in streams and things like that directly in them. So here's another image from Brad Lancaster. This is a before of a spot that's just not really much going on other than flooding. Couple tips. Ideally, you're not going more than 2 feet deep, no less than 9 inches. I think there's wiggle room there, but you basically want enough of a indentation in the earth that the water can sink in. Part of the reason why we don't want it too deep is that a lot of that soil life is higher in the soil. So if you get too deep, you lose some of that benefit, and the water potentially doesn't get as clean as it infiltrates in. If you are building a basin, sort of like Brad Lancaster was talking about, around a tree, you want it to be 1.5 times the diameter of the tree that you're planting in it. Ideally, the bottom of the basin is level enough that the water can spread out. Mulch them, as I mentioned before, and the edges can either be reinforced with stone, or you can grade to a 3-to-1 slope. So 3-to-1 that's the angle of repose. That means that at that angle, soil and materials will stop moving. They won't roll off. So for every 1 unit, we could say 1 foot of rise or vertical distance, you want 3 feet of horizontal distance. So it gives you, that's kind of the most slope that you can get before you get into issues with erosion. So there's that same image that we saw before after it's been planted out and developed as a rain garden by Brad Lancaster. Some cautions. Most trees will need to be, if you are working with trees in the way that he was, you'll want them to be on some sort of mound in there so that they're not drowning in that water. Always plan for that overflow. If you grab a gutter off of your house and you send it into a rain garden, and say it's half of your house, and there's a huge rain, we're getting bigger storms, and you send 1,000 gallons out there, is that space going to be able to hold that? And if not, where's it going to go? These are nice for new plantings. And you want to keep an upslope side. So if you've got a slope, you wouldn't want to berm that side because the water would have a harder time getting in. Some plants, I don't have this written down, but specific plants, because of this situation, we've got it's a boom bust scenario. So there's a lot of water and then sometimes no water. So Juncus and Carex are great genuses of plants that thrive in that sort of environment.
Chris, could you give some common name for Juncus and Carex? Folks who might not be familiar.
I think Juncus might be it's maybe like an elk grass. I'm not sure what the Carex, I can spell them and then you could look them up. Carex is Carex and Juncus is Juncus. And there are a bunch of different varieties of those, so different colors, different qualities, and but those are some good plant communities to explore. Hugelkultur is something I want to just briefly touch on. And that's basically where you take wood and you put it into an infiltration basin or a swale. And the idea is that this will sink carbon in a certain way, and this will absorb water and break down. And I've seen people do it with berms. I've mostly seen it closed, but this gives you a sense of kind of what it would look like before you closed over it. And so as this broke down, it would become pretty rich soil. Those pieces here look a little big to me, honestly. That looks like a lot of wood. I would probably want those a little smaller, but that's another technique that people use, particularly if you've got extra material that you're looking to get out of the way and don't want to take it off site. So swales is another arena, berms and basins, where we can work with rainwater, and they can look different ways. This looks like basically a swale in the center here that's full of plants where the runoff is running in. This is like a slope where basically earth was excavated here and piled on this side for the berm, and then the berm was planted out with fruit trees and strawberries and insectary plants. And so as water comes, it sinks in, feeds these plants. And in this case, this is a seed and straw. So grass seed was laid down in here. And each one of these, you can just see it barely here. Each one of these has an overflow down to the next one. So it'll fill a little bit and then overflow. So different possibilities on gentle slopes. These can work really nicely. And this became a whole citrus orchard for this person. Benefits, and it's good to mention contour swale. I'll get into it a little bit more, but that's another, basically we're running along a contour line. So the same elevation is what makes that possible. So in this image, when water sinks in here, these plants absorb it. It's more likely to come into this berm, so there's less need for irrigation, although there would be irrigation here as a backup. collects water from upslope and moves it down. Water runs downhill, but it sinks in and can basically create a sheet of water below the soil, reduces erosion and excess runoff, particularly if it's done well. And on a large scale, it can actually recharge water tables and make stream flow more consistent. So imagine if everyone was sinking their water into the landscape instead of sending it into the drain. There'd be a lot more water that's going back into the groundwater, which could recharge it over time. Okay. Here's another example of a swale system. In this case, so there's contour swales, and there are swales that would not be on contour that are more useful for basically transferring water, moving water across a landscape. In this case, they've laid out little barriers to slow the water down, and they've planted it out, but water is running along, sloping down from these two roads into the center and sinking in and cleaning as it goes. Locations, things to consider: gentle to moderate slopes. The higher in the watershed you can start, the better on your property or wherever. That basically just means that water is going to sink in higher up, and more water will go in to your landscape. Again, avoid drainages, streams and creeks, and typically you want them on a single contour, on a single elevation line. So this is an image to give you a sense of what those contour lines are, and a really simple way to find contours. So this person made an A-frame for themselves, A because it looks like an A, and basically, I'm sure you could find this on YouTube, but you get sticks together that are tied here, you get another stick here, and you hang a little weighted line, and you calibrate it so that basically this tells you the center. It will center itself when it's on the same elevation. So what this person has done, I don't know if you can see it that well, there are little flags, and this person walked along and moved one side and the other side and found equal elevation across her property. And so once she's got these flags laid out, she could dig a swale here and dump the soil on the downside slope there. And so water would infiltrate in, and the berm would help catch that. And so water coming off of this roof would sink in, and help with that garden. Tips on berms and basins. Typically better to overbuild than underbuild in case you blow something out, or in case you have a huge storm or whatever. So if you've got more berm and a little more basin, that's going to be helpful in case we get bigger storms, which I think we will be as time goes on. Spillway. So again, that's the overflow. What happens when it fills up? Reinforce that with stone. There's that 3-to-1 slope again. So these edges you'd want to have at the angle of repose, 3-to-1. The top of the berm being level is more important than the bottom. The bottom will still fill even if it's not 100% even. What you do want is that top to be even, because that will affect your overflow and things like that. This is a bunyip water level, just a little picture of it. Water does cool things like finds its level. So if you've got, these are basically rulers with a little tube that's been filled with water, and the tube is attached to the rulers, and you can move these rulers to different spots, and the water will show you the different heights. So you can see in this instance, when both of them are reading 38, the water is level. You want to compact the top of the berm, and you want to loosen the mulch basin so it sinks in better. Okay. Cautions. Landslides. With these systems, you need to be cautious. You need to be careful because you could have big consequences. You don't want to infiltrate huge amounts of water above a building or something like that where a landslide might happen. There's different situations where that's less risky, but if soil is shallow on top of bedrock, that is kind of that's the big one to watch out for. So if you sunk a bunch of water into that situation, there's a high likelihood that that soil would slip off. And if it was on a steep enough slope above a building, you potentially create a landslide. Again, giving some space to the building foundations. And you don't want to be catching too much water onto really steep slopes. In those instances, planting or planting's probably your best bet when you're really steep and the overflow. One last thing with the contours, this is another cool technique that I've seen used, particularly in something like a burn location. If you've got dead logs or dead trees, you could chip them, but you could also just knock them down to the ground and install them against the earth. It's nice if they're dug down a little bit, slightly into the earth, but you can, water will actually hit that and infiltrate. So that's another interesting way to slow and spread and sink water. So now we're getting into some other territory here, barrels and tanks. So this is, Blue Barrel is there's a company in Sonoma County that recycles blue barrels. So that's kind of a more almost of a DIY style. They can get tied together on the bottom. Each of these is 50 gallons. And that's an interesting way to do it. This is another interesting way, just a super simple DIY. And then we can get into more complex systems. So these are poly tanks, poly rain tanks, plastic tanks. These two center ones are 5,000 gallons, and these are called Bushman slimline tanks. So they are slim against the house. These are each 530 gallons, and this is a 1,000-gallon tank. And what this is showing here, this is what's called a wet line conveyance. So here, this is a dry line. You can't really see it, but this is coming directly from the gutter and dropping into the tank. So this line that's filling will dry out in between rains. In this instance, the line that's coming in is going to stay wet because water finds its level. So the gutter in this case is higher than this, and water will actually travel underground and fill these tanks. And then they're tied together here, so they fill equally. There's a little hose bib from that, and this is more of kind of the scope that Permaculture Artisans is working at, this level for the most part. And then there's big steel tanks, galvanized steel tanks. I'll actually talk about this for a second. go back to this. So someone asked about cost. So typically we're looking at about $3 to $5 per gallon captured for tanks. And obviously prices have gone crazy, so the prices of tanks are continuing to go up and things like that, but that's typically a decent ballpark for what it would cost to install rainwater catchment tanks. And steel tanks, these are big galvanized steel tanks. These actually become more cost effective at about, they can become more cost effective at about maybe 35,000 gallons or above. In this instance, these two tanks are tied together. You can potentially tie a bunch of tanks together if you wanted, and you can have a tank farm. There's typically a master tank, so one tank that's got pretty much everything you need for the system to run, and then you can just tie additional lines, additional tanks into it. With the galvanized tank, if you really have a lot of catchment potential and a lot of catchment need, I got some quotes recently for the installation of one of these tanks. Pioneer Water makes tanks like these, and it was I don't have the exact numbers, but somewhere around 40,000 gallons, $40,000 for like 35,000 gallons to put this in. That did not include hooking the tank up to the house. So you do need engineering at this level, but if we combine all of these different things, we combine tanks and different earthworks, we can get a pretty resilient system there. So key points to take away. Currently, we've got more of a water storage issue than water shortage, although some people might argue that that's changing with drought. Better to implement many small solutions rather than just a single large one. Slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, and share it. And it's better to do something small than not doing anything at all. And I like this little image. Life is not about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain. Thank you very much. And yeah, this was a new experience for me, not being able to see anyone while I was presenting. So hopefully that was helpful. And if there are questions, I'm happy to answer. And yeah, thank you all.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I mean, I thought it was excellent. We have one question so far, and I'm sure a few more will come in. I was just kind of answering some of the either Sonoma County specific or more straightforward questions throughout. So Gail is wondering, how long can water be stored in a poly tank for emergency use?
I would say indefinitely. Poly tanks are they're most of them are manufactured to potable standards at this point. The quality of the water is going to depend upon the system. So typically we want kind of an initial filtration at the level of the gutter. So keeping leaves out, things like that. So basically a debris filter. And then typically there'll be a first flush, which is basically the first water that hits your roof, this is particularly important in places where it rains and then doesn't rain for big periods of time. That first flush of water will go into containment that does not go into your tank. So if it hasn't rained in 3 months or 6 months, there's going to be a bunch of dust and debris, maybe bird droppings, things like that. And so that will come down with that initial rain and go into the first flush and avoid going in the tank. So the higher the quality of the water that goes into the tank, the higher the quality going out, and the better the storage is. Putting tanks into, they are also making tanks at this point that have what's called a sun shield. So they're more resistant to sunlight, which used to be a major issue. But still storing tanks in the shade is probably a good idea, and that will increase the quality of the water as well. And then if it's an emergency type situation, you could filter or boil that water if it was for your personal use. If it's going out into the landscape, the plants may even like a little bit of extra life in it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for storing it. And one thing we tend to like to do if we are storing water for use in irrigation, we'll have a top off valve. So either well water or municipal water to keep that irrigation system functioning, even if you've used all the rainwater from the previous year, depending on how much catchment there is. So different ways to play around with water storage.
Yeah, thank you. Leslie Taylor wants to know, does catching water like this have an effect on groundwater that goes into the aquifer? Am I shorting my well?
That's a great question. My sense is that you're actually probably helping your well. Basically what we're doing, it'd be interesting to do studies. I have not done this. What would happen if literally every single person caught 10,000 gallons? What would that do to water in the landscape? I think it would still be totally fine, is my guess. But basically what we're doing is we're slowing the water cycle down. So instead of these boom bust, which we're particularly seeing a fair amount these days, where it's dumping rain, huge amounts of rain, that becomes erosive and becomes problematic, we're actually taking that water and slowing it down, either passively or actively. If we put it into a tank, that slows it way down, and then we're extending the timing of that water going into the landscape, particularly if we're using that for irrigation later in the year. So water will still be getting onto your infiltrating into your land, particularly if you're using earthworks to infiltrate, like from an overflow, which is necessary. And then over time that water infiltrates in. So I think it's actually a beneficial effect for wells, is my take on it.
Great. Tor wants to know if there's any situation where you would bury a large tank and what benefits that would provide.
Burying tanks is a lot more expensive. It's more complicated. You typically are going to require a geotechnical report, which is a expensive engineering report. There are instances where you may want to, some people build tanks out of concrete. That's something that I didn't mention. But you could put concrete tanks into the earth. There's the benefit of fire resistance, potentially, if it's underground. A poly tank in the ground has a greater potential to pop up as the earth contracts and expands, depending on water levels and temperatures and things like that. So it needs to be properly secured. There are massive tanks that some people would put in the ground to store huge amounts of water, or to store other things, other liquids. But typically it's going to be a much more expensive project to try and put tanks underground.
Thanks. Yeah, there's a cool story tour out of the town of Bodega of work that Brock and Occidental Arts and Ecology did with the dairy that buried a massive amount of rainwater tanks. That would be worth checking out just to see what the possibilities there can be. Next question we've got from Leah kind of touched on this with the concrete tank, but she's worried that about the plastic in poly tanks because it can be a hormone disruptor. Are there any other options you know of besides, the huge galvanized tanks that would be an alternative to plastic?
There are smaller galvanized tanks as well. There are stainless steel tanks. I can't. Galvanized tanks are expensive, so they're probably 5 times as expensive as a poly tank, maybe more at this point. Stainless steel, I can't imagine how much more expensive they are. Yeah, some people make like a ferro cement tank, which is, you can basically take chicken wire and then have a thinner wall of cement. One thing about cement tanks, another designer who works at Permaculture Artisans lived in New Zealand for a long time, and she said cement tanks, that's kind of the go-to over there. But one thing to be aware of is that if they dry out and stay dry for too long, they can have issues with leakage. So some people will put they'll actually put a liner into a cement tank if that happens. But yeah, there are a lot of different options. Poly tanks oftentimes are the most affordable. Most affordable for getting a fair amount of catchment. But if yes, plastic is definitely problematic, and it's everywhere.
Mm-hmm. So Leah had another question. I'm not sure if you'll have an answer for this, but we can give it a shot. She's wondering why there's no permeable pavement anywhere, even in new construction, or at least very rarely.
I think some people are using it, and some of it actually you can't really tell the difference. So it very well could be permeable pavement. I think some people are resistant to change, so that's another possibility. But there are definitely progressive places that are realizing that it makes sense to have less impermeable surfaces. So I have seen rain gardens and things like that, or infiltration basins near certain parking lots and things like that, and different places that are doing curb cuts. So I think it is happening, probably not at the rate that would be ideal.
Yeah, and I would add, Leah, just from my own experience of talking to electeds in different municipalities and agency partners, is they kind of rely on both community members and people who work in these fields to bring ideas to them. They're overseeing so much. So I'm sure there are a lot of people in Petaluma or in Sonoma County in general who would love to see more permeable pavement throughout our communities. So if that's something you can rally your community around to bring that solution to change makers, decision makers, that's probably the only way it's going to happen. Okay, we've got a question about adding a rain garden and installing a gray water system at the same time to a yard that's about 20 by 30 feet. Is there a way to integrate the two systems that would minimize the amount of digging and additional materials. So basically a gray water system that is also a rain garden, if I'm reading it right.
Gray water is you don't want, and the county doesn't want gray water to daylight. So gray water needs to be in a mulch basin pretty much all the time. So that is a different setup than a rain garden. If you filled a rain garden with mulch, then it would look like a mulch basin. And it would be I think the way to go about that would be to just do gray water in mulch basins. And if I was going to do a rain garden, I would try and grab a gutter, a downspout, and put rainwater into it. I don't know if that helped, but.
Yeah, I think so. Another rain tank question. So once there's, sludgy water accumulated at the bottom, is there a way to clean the tank out?
So depending on what you do, some people will install like a little valve at the bottom, at the very bottom of the tank, that could be opened and water could run out through that. Art Ludwig, one of those other rain folks that I mentioned, actually likes to do that, and he likes to tilt his tanks at like a 1% slope, 1 or 2%. So if he gets in there, a big enough tank, like a 5,000 gallon tank, has a 2-foot hole for you to get into. If you wanted to get down in there and like muck out the sludge. So that would be 2 ways to do it. There are also, typically that sludge will settle. And if you have your inflow pipe, some people do this, if you're concerned about it, your inflow pipe can actually go down into the tank and come back up, so that the water doesn't disturb that sludge on the bottom. That's another possibility. Yeah, it's harder if you don't set those things up, but typically if that layer is undisturbed, it won't be a major problem, and you'll be drawing water above that layer of sludge.
Perfect, thank you. So I know you're not local these days, but Mary Beth is encountering some supply chain issues. She called over a dozen hardware stores, nurseries, agricultural suppliers, even Blue Barrel, who said the closest barrels they had were in Hayward. So she's looking for any ideas of where and when to get them. I don't have a good answer, so maybe you got some leads.
For 50-gallon barrels, like the blue barrels?
I think so. Mary Beth, can you clarify like those 55s that Blue Barrel uses? Not hearing from her in the chat. I think since she asked, since she mentioned Blue Barrel, that's what I'm. Okay, she said yes. Yeah.
So it looks like someone just said Craigslist could be a good option. I don't have any leads on those. I do know that places like National Storage Tank in Santa Rosa, they've got, I don't think they've got recycled barrels like that, but they do have lots of poly tanks, and including like a 200-gallon tank, and those are in stock as far as I'm aware.
Great, thank you. So we've got 2 more questions here, and then I'll run us through some very, very brief wrap-up slides, like 2 minutes maximum. So this might be a complex answer though. How much storage would you suggest for a small, medium-sized Petaluma city lot for irrigation of outdoor plantings and veggie garden? And I don't know if we'll be able to really answer that without more detail, but you can give it a shot.
Yeah, that depends on square footage of the square footage that you're irrigating, the type of plants that you've got in there, and soil and things like that. So there are a lot of different different factors that come into play there, but my guess is that the larger constraint would likely be, and maybe not if it's a medium size in Petaluma, it's hard to say. Space might be the larger constraint. Of a 5,000 gallon tank, there are different diameters for those, but basically like 10 to 12 feet wide. So that's a decent amount of space to take in a lot. So, and they do make soda can sized tanks, which are taller than they are wide. We tend to not use those just out of some sort of concern for earthquakes. They're probably earthquake rated, but we prefer them to be at least as wide as they are tall. Yeah.
Yeah, Jennifer, if you want to follow up with me in an email with some more detail, we can try to help you get more of a range, but I think it would take a while back and forth trying to figure that out here live. So just a last question here. This might be another kind of complex one. Mainly interested in a smaller rainwater catchment system. Due to having a small yard, it would be difficult to create ponds or berms. Probably only need 100 to 200 gallon system since it's only the two of them. How much handy person skills would be needed to install the system by themselves? So I think, again, this is probably like a blue barrel situation.
Yeah, could be blue barrel, could be another sized barrel, but it can be a really simple system. Like we saw that one image of someone who just cut into their gutter and went straight into a barrel with a little downspout on it, which you could hook up to a hose. So that would be really simple. If we're talking about first flushes and leaf eaters and that level of stuff, it gets more complicated, but it's plumbing, like gluing PVC pipes together and things like that. So moderate, anywhere from not a lot of skill to moderate skill, and some systems, if you're using pump and pressure, to much more skilled. So it's a whole variety. But
Yeah.
simple is nice. Simple is good, particularly if you don't have a big need. Maybe going with that picture, like what we saw, where there's not a first flush and you're cleaning that thing out after every season, and you don't need to worry too much about it.
Yeah. Just make sure you use some screening to keep mosquitoes out if you go with that really simple one.
Yeah.
The last thing I would add is that when we do, we had a hands-on rainwater installation recently. And so people come as volunteers, they get some hands-on experience. Some of those people left feeling, equipped to do their own system just from that brief educational experience. And some people still felt like they would need to hire help. So it really varies person to person. And with that, I will just show us very quickly. We've got some wonderful events. Oops, I chose from beginning. Luckily, there aren't many. Some other wonderful events coming up. Very on theme on Thursday night. We're having a webinar to launch a countywide rainwater harvesting rebate. So if you're thinking about implementing these solutions, some of the municipalities have existing rebates for them, but especially for our our rural community members who don't have access to those rebates, this is a really good opportunity. So come to get the details. We've got an in-person insect investigation in Santa Rosa coming up. Opportunities to learn about the leadership program I mentioned. We're looking at some water-wise gardens in Windsor, and then everyone's favorite, juiciest topic of all time, programming irrigation controllers, which is very important. We'll try to make it fun for you towards the end of the month. And that's what we've got going on this month. We'd love to see you at any of those. This program happened through the partnership we have with the city of Petaluma and with Permaculture Artisans, where Chris works. But a lot of our work is funded through our sponsors, who we are eternally grateful for. That said, a lot of our overhead costs are just covered by our community members. So if you feel inspired, you learn something, and you're feeling a little generous, we appreciate any amount of donation you can make to keep the lights on at Daily Acts. And with that, I will say goodnight to you all. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you again, Chris, for such an informative presentation.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone for the good questions and your attention, and good luck.
Absolutely.
I hope you have good rainwater catching adventures.
And again, we're sending the follow-up email. We'll have resources. If you have additional questions, either for me or for Chris, you can send them to me. I can relay them, or we can try to answer them at Daily Acts. I look forward to hearing from you. And if you install any of these solutions, send us pictures. Tell us about it. We want to know.
Yeah.
All right. Good night,
Good
everybody.
night.